Steak Bites, where we carve out space for meaningful conversations that go beyond the grill. I'm Kara Smith, your host and fellow enthusiast for all things tasteful and fulfilling. Today, we're talking about sovereignty. It's not just a buzzword, but a philosophy that influences how we eat, live, and connect with the world around us. Joining us today is Nolan Wilson, a former D1 athlete and the host of the Art and Science of Becoming Sovereign podcast. Nolan's work is devoted to optimizing health and sovereignty through genuine connections with food and the ranchers and farmers behind it. His perspective will inspire you to think differently about your relationship with food and what it means to live intentionally. Let's dig in.
Let's do it.
Welcome, Nolan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kara. It's an honor.
Well, I appreciate it. It was about a year ago that I was on your podcast, and when the topic of sovereignty, particularly food sovereignty, came to mind, you were the top of my list. So I'd love for you to dive into that concept. What does sovereignty mean, and how is that driving what you're currently doing?
That's a great question, and it's definitely a core question to who I am and sort of my upbringing and how I've developed as a young man. Sovereignty to me, simply put, is the ability to live life how I want to live life. I don't want to be under the domain of anyone but God, really. And under that, I think there's a lot of different pillars like nutrition and vitality and food, like you mentioned. But sovereignty in general, to answer your question, is just the ability to live how I see fit, how to one day raise my family as I see fit, how to interact with my community and things like that as I see fit.
Sure. How do you think that's changed?
It's interesting because I think for a while, and I'm a relatively young man, but I think for a while as I was growing up in my early 20s, it was in the negative direction. There was a lot of infringements on people's sovereignty, infringements on people's freedom, and sort of some retraction of people's ability to like live the life they want. That said, I think as I think you're aware, I mean, tomorrow or next week is the inauguration of the new administration. Regardless of your thoughts about that, I think it's a sign with all the Make America Healthy Again stuff, that with Kennedy and all these different things that are happening. I think it's a sign that people are really starting to focus on it more and more. Sovereignty is starting to become a more important pillar in people's lives. And I don't know if it's going to get taken off YouTube or whatever I say the word COVID, but I think during COVID, a lot of people, that was like the eye opener for a lot of people, that, oh, wow, there's a chance where I can go to the grocery store and there not be food there.
Right.
There's a chance I can do, I can want to go to dinner with my family and I can't have food. So then the question of sovereignty, and more particularly food sovereignty, comes into play. And I think that's becoming a mainstream topic, which excites me. And I'm sure it excites you as well.
It does. It's, part of when we started Colorado Craft Beef was to get back to that, to get back to where your food comes from, put the face back to the people that are producing it, but also put that intentionality back at the forefront. We're really thinking about what we put in our bodies and how we move our bodies and how that impacts all of our relationships. It impacts what we do, how we do it. Which is really I would say a pivotal moment of kind of the intentionality, which I equate maybe sovereignty to some of the intentionality too. So do you feel like that is an appropriate track of thinking about it in that way?
Certainly. I think intentionality I don't think you can live a sovereign life or live with sovereignty over your life or agency over your life without being intentional at all. Because especially with the amount of things that are pulling our attention in so many different directions nowadays, if you're not intentional, then you have like almost no choice but to follow the herd and end up like so many people in the instance 4 or 5 years ago, where you don't have food and then you have no choice but to not live sovereign, and you're at the beck and call of however you can get your food. So yeah, I think intentionality and sovereignty go hand in hand for sure.
Sure. How do you think that we can address this? As a society, you're making movements that way, getting more information out on your podcast. We're driving to connect people back with where their food comes from. What other steps do you think that we can put in place, or what would you like to see to make this more of a mainstream type movement?
That's a really good question, and a core philosophy of mine, given the, like I already mentioned, the mass amount of information and data and news and all this stuff that can pull our attention away from ourselves and our immediate community. I believe that at the core of that is individual sovereignty. Like, so becoming, like, focusing on my own ability to live a healthy, sovereign life. I think that all of that then percolates throughout your family. When the family is sovereign and they are intentional with their life, their community is typically going to follow suit. When a community follows suit, then you'll have neighboring communities, and then all of a sudden you have a whole state that's aligned, or at least similarly aligned. Then you get back to what I hope to see one day, which is an entire country that's aligned. I think it's partially what we were founded on too, is the ability to be sovereign on a national level, a state level, a communal level, a familial level, and then an individual level. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I sort of see the steps of that taking place.
Sure. It's been eye-opening for me. So I come from, the ranching industry. So we always, that's what I've lived and breathed my whole life, is cows and land, and how that's interconnected. Yet I didn't realize all of the other externalities that actually play a role in what we can or we can't do as far as food production. So, for example, government regulation, or, not to get into the political side, but the Farm Bill, that actually is very nuanced, because there's a social side to the Farm Bill, and then there's the side of the Farm Bill that's actually, has like farm subsidies, but so much of it is making sure that we can still feed our people in our country. So that's something to me that I didn't realize how interconnected so many things are, like kind of a systems approach to that. Do you think with this, the food sovereignty side, or sovereignty as a whole, how would you break that down? I mean, would you say that there's different kind of silos? Is there other things at play? Maybe something that needs to rise to the top?
Well, that's interesting. And before I answer that, I want to ask you a question real quick. If I remember correctly, part of your change, or the evolution of your focus, was when you had children, correct? You realized, okay, this is what I want to feed my children,
Yes.
or what do I want to feed my children?
Yes, of course. I've always been an avid beef eater. That's what we had. So it was more of that's what I knew, and that's what we always ate, because I was a rancher's daughter. So protein was a very heavy focus for us. Of course, red meat was the center of pretty much every plate we had. And I didn't realize that I actually was so blessed in that, to be able to grow up that way. And then I became pregnant with my first daughter. And to that point, I hadn't put as much stock into what I actually put into my body until I was feeding another human.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's a level of ownership that I wasn't quite ready for. That I'm basically setting this child up for hopefully success from how I'm fueling my body that's fueling their body. And that did turn that thought process around for me, of making sure that I was very intentional about the nutrition and the externalities, and just being more intentional about what was actually going into my body, because it wasn't just impacting me, it was impacting my baby.
Yeah. See I think that's related to how I want to answer that question, because you bring up silos and how things can be separate. An example is children. I think a lot of eating patterns or nutritional patterns or foundations are laid as children. So you have the idea of a silo being a family. Maybe you and your family, let's say you guys weren't already very sovereign, living on a ranch, having access to high quality food. A typical family in America, they might want to feed their children healthy food that's going to actually nourish them and allow them to develop properly. That's a silo. But then you go to their school system, and you brought up the Farm Bill, which is legislation and the legality of that type of stuff. I'm not familiar with the intricacies of that bill particularly. But then you go to the food system in public schools, and that's a whole nother silo, and it's like almost cut off from what you're feeding your kids at school. And then you go on to college, and then post college into work and all these things. But I want to focus on the school system. I think that's super important. I think what you did is extremely commendable, because I don't know if it's a product of how you were raised or if you just had this sort of insight, but a lot of parents don't have that maybe they don't have the knowledge. I'm not sure. Maybe you could speak to what you think it is being a parent and having that instance, but they don't have the knowledge to sort of bring those silos together. Like, okay, I'm feeding my kid here at home this food. I'm sending them off to this school to feed them this. I don't know if you have any insight onto how to like bridge the gap between silos like that. I'm curious to hear your take. Sorry to flip the script on you.
No, you're good. I haven't thought about it in that frame of reference. What I would say is this is a very science-driven thought for me of where I ended up with, the children conversation. Because I've shared this on podcasts before and even on our social that I'm a glorified cow nerd, frankly. Like I've lived and breathed that my whole life. And I spent 10 years in animal health, and there's some incredibly insightful research in cow nutrition on what we feed a cow in her third trimester, where that tail end of pregnancy, and how that actually sets that, whether they have a steer or heifer or whatever it is, how it sets them up for success or failure in life. And that was where I was like, oh, not equating us to cows, yet we are mammals as well. And seeing the impact of the nutrition and the nutritional plane of that cow in her third trimester, basically dictating what that calf will be, spoke to me. I was like, that's not insignificant, because we can do that research in cattle. We're not doing that type of research in humans. It's, of course, a very different model. There's not a whole lot of fetal research that happens as far as looking at a mother's nutrition and how that impacts basically the plane of their offspring. So that was a very science-driven thought for me personally, but it's something that I continue to keep pretty near and dear to my heart, and I'm willing to buck the system is probably the answer of that. I send beef sticks in my kids' bags to preschool every day, and I'm that mom that, if I get them back after preschool and they're hangry, I'm like, please tell your teacher at school that you have a beef stick in your bag and you need that, especially if your snack at school was sugary and not packed with protein, frankly, or a ton of nutrition. Please go to your cubby and grab your beef stick. I'm like, I'll stand behind you 100%. Yep. I will buck that system for you. That is fine. It doesn't bother me a bit. So I guess I've been okay with that, of kind of bucking that system.
Yeah, well, that's one of the cool things about Colorado craft beef and a lot of the other ranches out there that are doing stuff like that, with the beef sticks particularly and things of that sort. For a while there, I think there was this like period where that type of stuff wasn't accessible, or at least it wasn't as accessible to some family that lives in a city not close to a ranch or something. But they can actually now, like you just said, give their kid, and you said the snack at schools that has like little nutrition or a lot of sugar. Most snacks and foods at school have like zero nutritional value at all. So it's cool to see you guys like solve that problem, if that makes sense, because that now becomes a really accessible snack for kids. And obviously kids are very, they're developing, and what better time to fill your body with actual nutrition and nutrients that will allow you to develop properly than when you're a kid going to pre-K and fifth grade and all this type of stuff. So I want to commend y'all for that. I think it's very cool.
Well, thank you. That is one of kind of our core ethos too, is that of let's figure out how to get more protein into people's hands. And if we look at an actual like global perspective of protein, I mean, it is a global conversation, because when people move out of, the lower to middle class, typically the first thing they change is their protein. They increase their protein consumption or their protein quality. So that's from even a global beef perspective, that's one of those challenges that we're looking at. How do we produce more higher quality protein on a global level to help fuel people?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because it's a much more digestible. Say somebody didn't come from your background or my background where they're eating a lot of red meat and stuff growing up and they're not ready to buy a half cow or whatever from you guys or a lot of beef. The the beef sticks and things like that are a more digestible way. I think that they can get that type of stuff into their diet, into the diet of their kids. They probably, honestly, will see some level of increase in attention span, focus, enhanced behavior in kids. Because I know, like, I mean, we could get into that if you'd like, but a lot of the stuff that these kids eat and the rise in ADHD and all these ailments that kids are plagued with, I think that's an interesting concept as well. Buy beef sticks or some small box, they get privy to the idea or the benefits of eating more red meat, more protein, and then they're like, oh wait, this actually has some real benefit. I'm going to go make that next step, which is buying, I don't know what you guys sell, like half a cow or maybe even a full cow, which would be the ultimate goal.
Sure. Yeah, it is kind of a stair step to like that intentionality and that thought of what you are putting in your body. Uh, I always like to have practical applications, for our listeners. So if somebody wants to take that next step to sovereignty or intentionality, I mean, whatever kind of word we want to think, particularly when it comes to nutrition, but just in general, what types of tips could you give our listeners for that?
For sovereignty specific, like generally, or like more
Let's
particularly
let's do
nutrition?
both.
Ooh, so sovereignty particularly, I think um a rule that I like to abide by is just being genuinely curious, if that makes sense. Like just genuinely being curious about, okay, well, I've been told since I was in second grade that this is good for me or whatever. Just question it, because maybe you'll find out that that's true. There you go. No problems. No problems there. If I question something and I'm like, wait a second, I find another level deeper, maybe that's a lie. I'll go find some more information. And then you can start making decisions for yourself, if that makes sense. So I think genuine curiosity, questioning the paradigms that you've been fed, no pun intended, your entire life, I think that's a really good way to open your eyes to understand where is sovereignty lacking in my life? Where am I maybe following the herd blindly? And then how can I adjust that? That's sort of meta. I don't practical. I don't know if that falls into the practical bucket. I think the one thing that I think is really helpful, people like yourself, this is sort of nutritional, but it also stems to sovereignty generally. Going to actual ranches. I know a lot of people who have not ever stepped foot on a ranch or like met a rancher, not even their own rancher, but like shook somebody's hand and talked to them about their food, talked to them about the problems and the plights of what they're doing. But that's been a really instrumental thing for me. And part of the benefit of having my podcast is meeting folks like yourself, ranchers in Georgia and Texas and California, and actually being able to understand all of the things that they have to deal with to put food on the table for us. I think that's a really eye-opening experience that could then allow somebody to start questioning other things or gaining information or going down other rabbit holes. But yeah, I think being genuinely curious is the number one thing, in my opinion, just questioning what you've been told.
I love that. Curiosity can go a long ways. It really, and you can open yourself up to some conversations that you never imagined having either. That's what I found to be really cool about that, about being genuinely curious about, for example, like your background and what led you to this topic and kind of this, passion project of getting into food sovereignty. Um, I think that's a pretty cool thing and pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's everybody comes to it differently. I think I have many friends who are sort of on the same path, and as I said, I'm a younger man, which is maybe an important point to make, maybe a hopeful or optimistic point to make. That there is, I'm not just saying this. There's an undertone of like an undertone of people, younger people specifically, that are actually starting to like earlier on. It's not taking people to be in your position to have children. I know people that are 21, 22-year olds, college athletes still, that are like, okay, I'm going to start eating more steak. I'm going to start eating higher quality foods. So I just think it's exciting for me to come from that perspective, where, because it can kind of be diluted, like when you watch the news and stuff, it can be a little bit doom and gloom. But there is a really cool movement happening where people are really starting to focus on this from a younger age, which I think will pay dividends for communities and the nation long term.
I agree. The generational side of that and some of the inherent knowledge or lack thereof, maybe more tradition that comes along with food is something that I think we could be more curious about of, as you mentioned, why we eat what we do, or some of the traditions that go along with that. I mean, I've shared this on a podcast before as well. A couple of my guests, they've had their own journey with food, and a lot of it was taught. It was you had a bad day, let's have some food. You had a good day, let's celebrate with some food. So it's almost more mental than the physical side of fueling your body, which is, I mean, maybe that's another topic of conversation later for a psychologist guest. I don't know,
Yeah.
but the psychological side of food as well.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, because one thing that I along the lines of curiosity, one thing that I find to be fruitful in my own life and people that I've talked to in my own podcast is the idea of experimenting. I think a lot of people get ingrained, like you said, they get taught these almost conditions. They're like, okay, well, this is what I eat just because this is what I've always eaten. What I would encourage listeners of yours, I'm assuming if they're listening to Steak Bites, it's done by Colorado Craft Beef, they're probably relatively understanding of the idea of high nutrient quality foods or dense foods. But experimenting with what you eat, like spend a month and say, you know what, this month, I'm not going to try to save my whole life or change my whole life, but this month, I'm just going to try to eat 50% more high quality protein, and then just see how you feel. Because that was one of the things for me when I was playing college athletics. I was like always experimenting, trying to find some advantage. And that's what kind of got me on my health, sovereignty, vitality journey, is I noticed things when I started experimenting. I would eat this type of food for a certain period of time, and I would notice, you bring up the mindset and mentality. Oh, I was more focused in class. I was more focused in practice. I performed better when I ate these types of things. And then it was not the case with certain other things. But I think that's a really important principle as well, is just the idea of being willing to experiment, gathering data, and then using that data to make better decisions moving forward.
It's really hard to manage what you don't measure. That's a very, very difficult thing. And I know a lot of people that didn't realize how good or bad they felt either, because there wasn't that, kind of stopping for a second and that conscious thought. And this is maybe another topic of how to ingrain that from my own personal perspective, especially with our children. That's been a passion project, I guess, let's say for me, is to try to not say, hey, you should eat this and not that, but ask them how that makes them feel. How do you feel when your tummy is full of protein versus after you just ate an entire candy bar? Like, ask your body, take a second and let it talk to you, because I'm not going to be, and I won't always be standing over their shoulders saying, hey, let's make good food choices. Let's choose this over that. Could you touch on that? Maybe some other thoughts, not only just children, but other people in general that are on this journey.
First off, I agree completely. I think that there is, if nothing, there's this quote I love. It's very simple, but if nothing changes, nothing changes. So some people that are listening might be feeling phenomenal. They might already be like vital and healthy and feeling very energetic and in a good headspace and physical space, which is awesome. Continue doing what you're doing. But if that's, I've been in the position where that was not the case, where I felt more lethargic, I had worse energy, I was less focused at work or in school. If you don't change anything, then that won't change. So you're exactly right. Like, your children are a great example. You're not going to be able to just, hey, don't eat that candy bar, eat this steak over here. So they have to be aware of like what's happening in their body. So the answer to your question, in my opinion, is awareness. Like, how do you become aware? And I really do believe, allowing space and time to reflect on things, how they make you feel. Because I would actually be willing to bet maybe you agree or disagree, but most people don't even ask themselves, oh, how did I feel after I ate that? Or how I've been eating this way for the last week, kind of inconsequentially. How do I feel? Most people don't allow that. And it might sound a little cliche, but one thing that I know several people that do, especially when they're making changes in their diet or their lifestyle, is they'll actually just journal. So then it allows you to take that second and think, okay, well, I ate, for me, I'm like 230 pounds. So like I ate a pound and a half or whatever of ground beef today. I feel X, Y, and Z, or maybe I ate 4 cream pies at the gas station and I don't feel super good. So just allowing yourself that time and space to reflect and become aware of how things make you feel. I think to your point about your children, that's how ultimately they'll be able to grow up and make decisions on their own and be aware of how those decisions will affect them, if that makes sense.
For sure. So to the topic of really honing in on the nutrition piece. So whether it's, your food origins or what you're eating, etc. Do you have any tools or resources, if people want to go learn more? So whether it's, of course, your podcast would be a great place to be able to explore that further. Do you have any other tools or resources outside of that you'd share with the listeners?
There's a lot. It's almost an excess of options makes people choose none. So I think that's a really important question. One thing that, and this is going to sound so cliche, and I don't mean it to be, but the Paul Saladinos and the Liver Kings and people on social media that share this type of information, think about them whatever you want to think about them. A lot of these types of accounts will relay nutritional information about, hey, this food in the grocery store does this to your body, and here's how. This food on the meat shelf does this to your body. Here's how. Here's the nutritional breakdown of this type of food or whatnot. So I would say I really find those accounts, Paul Saladino, been pretty instrumental for me in terms of just minimizing junk food and like actually understanding why that junk food. Because when we actually understand why things work the way they do, I think it's easier to make decisions. If I understand why that this processed junk food is bad for me, and I understand like really what's happening, I'm going to be much less likely to consume it than if somebody just said, hey, that's bad for you. So that, I think, there's several podcasts, and I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head, but a lot of them are smaller, just some of my friends. But there's podcasts out there, and what I can do too, so you can link them in your show. I can link some podcasts and send them to you, and they can be in your show notes. But podcasts were instrumental. I'm sure a lot of people were on a podcast right now. It's such an incredible medium for learning information. Social media, I really do think if you use it right, can be a powerful tool in terms of information as well. And then documentaries, actually. This is an interesting, there's actually a documentary coming out soon this year sometime called The Animal Documentary, and it's on the carnivore diet specifically, but it's basically like a deep dive into the power of meat and the nutritional power of meat. Because do you remember when, like, what are the names of them? Like the Game Changers, and there was another like Netflix documentary that came out about like veganism and vegetarianism. Do you remember those?
I don't remember them. That was
okay.
I've always been pretty hardcore carnivore, so that probably wasn't in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, well, me either. That's the interesting thing. I never watched either of them, but they made a big wave, and people saw this information. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to go vegan and vegetarian." That said, there's a lot of documentaries that are Food Lies. If you know that page on Instagram, that's a great page. I think there's a documentary called Common Ground that's really interesting. There's a documentary called it's about cows and food. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but documentaries are another great way. I've learned a lot from documentaries, even if they're not super big or high budget. They really go in depth on certain topics, whether it be cattle or nutrition or lies that we're fed from the food system that we are a part of. But yeah, I apologize for not being able to cite like specific podcasts and things like that.
If you send them to me later, we'll put them in the show notes so listeners can find them.
Perfect.
One thing I would like to explore, because this is something that I have personally struggled with in some ways, is the food labeling side of it. So not necessarily just the eat this or eat that, but this is better because of this. So I've always encouraged our customers, listeners, friends, etc., to like get to the bottom of what that food label actually means. And typically it's a dollar associated with that, not necessarily always a health benefit. So to your point about curiosity, that's what I always encourage everybody is to really get down to the nuts and bolts of the food labeling side. I mean, we've gone from organic to regenerative to grass fed to no GMO to, I mean, there's been a lot of food labels that have been in some ways thrown around for a dollar perspective, not necessarily maybe for the actual rationale that we have in our minds behind them. So
Yeah, that I think what you just brought up is very important. And that was actually a paradigm shift for me that was really powerful. Food labels, most people don't look at them, which isn't, they look at the calories and the fats and all that stuff. Very simple in terms of making an actual change. Talk about practical things. I would encourage anybody that's listening to this, next time, most people buy their groceries at a grocery store. Next time you're in the grocery store and you pick up a box of cereal or some sort of processed food or something of the sort, even some non-processed foods like in the meat and seafood aisles, look at the nutrition or the nutrient labels, not the nutrient labels, the ingredient labels, not how many calories, not how many grams of fat or protein. Look at, sometimes it's 30 different things. And to me, just intuitively, I'm like, okay, well, if it took 30 different ingredients, 28 of which I can't pronounce, something's a little bit off about that intuitively to me. You know what I love about steak? It's one ingredient.
yes.
I don't have to think about it other than, okay, well, what's steak? That's the ingredient. Bam, I'm going to eat it. Obviously, there's nuance like where it was raised and all that stuff. But generally speaking, that is one of the, and I've actually had people in my own life say, dude, I got my mom reading ingredient labels now or whatever happens. And it really does make a difference because you become aware of like, holy cow, no pun intended again, but holy cow, there's like 20 ingredients in most of the foods in grocery stores, which intuitively doesn't make sense to me. And I would say to most people, it probably something's off about that.
For sure. I had another guest on the podcast that we talked about this specific thing, and you know she's been very health focused, yet I think had a little more of the nuance of the food labels, and she's been down a couple different rabbit trails of whether it's vegan, vegetarian, etc. You name it. She's like, I found myself buying organic macaroni and cheese. She's like, and I had to look at myself in the mirror and be like, why am I doing this? Like, I just paid how much more for a box of organic macaroni and cheese versus.
What does that even mean?
I don't
Yeah,
know.
like how can mac and
Yeah,
I don't know.
She was like, when I probably should have made the trip to the outside of the grocery store aisle where the non-processed foods were and made that choice versus, you know, buying organic over conventional macaroni and cheese. Like, that's fair. Sometimes we cannot see the forest through the trees or vice versa. It's yeah.
What you
Something to
just
have
brought up is another
conversation
great point as well. In terms of grocery stores, there, I actually for a while I was actually writing for health brands on Twitter, and I wrote several threads on this exact topic in terms of the layouts of grocery stores and why they are laid out that way, and how if you look at, you can look this up, you can look up grocery store layout aerial, and it'll show you pictures, the meat, the dairy, the produce, the vegetables, all that stuff that's on the outside because it's harder to get to. Like if I want to go from dairy to fruit, then I have to go all the way across the store. They want everybody in the middle. Do you know why? Because that's where all the profit is, because that's where all the processed food is, and that's where all the margin is. So that's another really simple thing to take note of, I think. And like I said, I think becoming aware of things is how you ultimately make change. Becoming aware of like, oh, wow, every food from this aisle to this aisle is processed and has 15 ingredients. Every food over there is one ingredient. Every food over there is one ingredient. Maybe I'll just stay on the outside of the grocery aisle. And then you eat that way for a month. Like I said, take stock of how you feel. And I would be willing to bet that most people would be ecstatic at how good they feel.
Yes. That's a great example of asking the why. And the more you understand the why, you're like, oh, that makes a whole lot more sense. Just something simple as that is a grocery store layout.
It's every grocery store too.
It's
Everyone.
every last one of them. And it comes down to the almighty dollar because they're a business, which is the reality of it, but also may not necessarily be the best thing for us personally. So
You don't see steak at the checkout aisle. You know how you see like the junk foods, the candy bars, the sodas, all that stuff. You never see steak or fruit or vegetables in the checkout aisle, which is something to take note of for sure.
If something stays good in my cabinet for 2 years, that may not be the best choice.
Very rarely in nature does there, maybe there's like pemmican or some specific examples where people can preserve food, but very rarely in nature does a food stay edible or viable for that long. So that's a great point as well.
So what other thoughts, Nolan, as far as sovereignty, whether it's tips or things that you've learned throughout your podcast?
Sovereignty, it can kind of be a buzzword. I think it sort of can be overused, as a lot of words can, but to me it's just so important to me. This is just how I've always been. I want to, like you said, the why. I've always just been that curious guy. Like, okay, well, I was told this. Well, why? I was told this. Why? Some things I continue to agree with. Some things I'm like, okay, well, maybe I should take a step back, reassess. But it really comes down to the question of how do I want to live? Like, we all have a life, and it's a gift, and we get to decide really how we live it. I want to be able to live my life in the best way as I see fit. I don't have children yet, but I want to be able to raise my children in a way that I see fit. And I think to that point, I'm glad you brought that up. The reason I think nutrition is foundational to sovereignty as a whole, there's really it's a bunch of circles inside of one another in terms of sovereignty. And at the bottom, the most inner circle is your health and vitality. So if I want to be a sovereign individual, that means I need to be financially secure. I need to be food sovereign. I need to have a good community, because there's a lot of studies actually about natural disaster success and all these different things, and the pivotal role that how tight knit a community is in surviving and thriving through those natural disasters and things like that. If I want to show up and live sovereignly in those different arenas of my life, I have to be vital and I have to be healthy. If I want to do that, then I have to take stock and be intentional, to use your word, intentional about what I'm putting in my body, what nutrients am I getting, what am I not putting in my body? That's another thing. What things am I staying away from? So yeah, I think that's a core belief of mine, is that sovereignty stems from vitality and the ability to show up with energy and focus and health. Because as I'm sure you're aware, there's a saying, the healthy person has 1,000 wishes. The unhealthy person has one, and that's for their health. So I think it all stems from health and vitality. And what we've been talking about is really the nutrition, and what we're putting into our body is core to that.
That's great. That's as you mentioned that about the health and vitality. This was something that has been kind of ingrained as an ag producer in general. For me, is when we think about just food and having food. So thinking about, the hands that are doing that, of just the thought process that somebody would go through if they didn't have food. I mean, because a hungry person has one problem. All the other problems don't matter. So I think that's a great tie to what you just said, is it does start from that. Being able to be fueled, and then how you're fueled to be able to see how you show up in the world.
Well, on that note, you just reminded me of something. I know you, or I at least know you used to. I don't know if you're still on the mats doing some jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
So that's another thing. Sovereignty across that in that domain, being able to protect yourself and your loved ones. That's another aspect of sovereignty. Being able to show up at work and produce income and produce value for people and serve people. That's an aspect of sovereignty. If you're unhealthy, or if you're not giving your body what it needs to be able to function properly, good luck going to jiu-jitsu several times a week, or the gym several times a week, or showing up and doing your best at work, or serving as best you can. I think that like I said, just to reiterate that point, because I think it's so important for me, the idea that all of that stems from my ability to actually enter those arenas vitally and healthily. So I couldn't agree more.
Perfect. So what's next, Nolan? What's next in your mission to promote this, to promote sovereignty, intentionally living? What does that look like?
Well, yeah. So as we spoke about before we went live, I just recently rebranded my podcast. So you technically went on the Tyro experience. It's now the art and science of becoming sovereign. One thing that I've been really called to do recently is learn from, obviously I've had like almost 100 conversations with folks like yourself and learned so much. There's so many people that have had books read about them. So I'm starting to do a part of my podcast where I read about different figures, founding fathers, entrepreneurs, historical figures of that sort, and trying to find common threads or through lines through their lives as well, intertwined with the conversations I've had and will continue to have. So that's next on my podcast side. But in terms of what's actually on the horizon from a meta perspective and like nationally, I think that we're in for a real ride here with the talk about make America healthy again and the awareness side of things. I really think it's becoming a more mainstream topic, like seed oils, for example. Seed oils was like not talked about at all. They were like, nobody even thought twice about them 3-4 years ago. And now that's like they're talking about it on a presidential stage. So I think what's next really is like you could call it an American Renaissance in a way. Me and some of my friends have coined it that there's like this reawakening happening where people are starting to take into account all these different things, sovereignty being one of them. So I'm excited. I think that's on the horizon. What that actually means for folks like myself and ranchers like you and your family, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's something to be excited about.
I'm excited too. Our youngest daughter she'll be starting kindergarten in the fall. And one of my kind of pain points has been food in schools, frankly, that were coming from those guidelines that I think are a little bit misaligned. So being able to see that there is this shift, not only for myself, but looking at the future of our children and the future of the country is really exciting. To the seed oil conversation, we just entered the tallow market, and
I saw that.
It's been wild. And also it's like back to our roots of like incredible cooking that we've kind of forgotten about. And all of a sudden, here we are. We're kind of back where we started. It
Exactly.
went full circle. But, to the point of looking at history, typically if we don't understand a lot of the history, it will repeat itself. So being a little more aware of where things came from, why we're here, and then seeing how we change that for the future is a big thing.
I have a question for you on that note, because you probably, not even probably, you almost certainly have more insight than me. In terms of food in schools and you having children that are in these schools, how do you see that bridge being gapped? Like, how do you see that problem being solved to get more high quality food in the stomachs of developing children?
So I think some of it for a national level will have to come from the governmental side, because that is how it is regulated at this point. What I do see from your comment about a community, there are communities, there are schools that are making that shift. They're purchasing more from more real whole foods. We have sent quite a bit of product into some of our local schools. The school that we are looking to send our daughters to, they're very good about that. They will put additional funding into their school lunch program to source from, and I'm not saying that local is the end all be all, but from local producers to where they have fresh, high quality food versus processed food that's making a trek a long ways, and of course costs less. So I do think that there is power in the school systems to be able to look at allocating funds differently. So whether they're shifting part of their budget from X over to Y, which becomes the nutrition of their children. That's a possibility that can be done. Some of it, there's red tape, of course, with anything, as we know. But looking at it from two perspectives, I'm looking at it from, we could say even from a sovereignty concept of how we help drive that change for our community and for our children. We're always looking at ways to be able to put more high quality protein into schools.
That's amazing. How cool would it be if there was like some deal where like every school had a partner ranch or something, and that's where they got their food from? That'd be pretty cool.
It is cool. And even our local communities, we have like our cattlemen's groups and our cattle women's groups that we're going in to talk to a lot of these kids, even in our rural communities that don't have a true understanding of where their food comes from. They're removed from it. So we have days that we go in and have chats with the elementary school. Our FFA programs are a huge piece of that to continue to bolster where food comes from. The people that produce it within agriculture. There are some of that in urban schools, maybe not quite as much, but I would say to our urban listeners to encourage that. Encourage your kids to ask those questions of the administration, or you go in, on parent-teacher conference or whenever you see fit to have those conversations with the school administration. Because I would say the more these conversations are had and the more it's at the forefront of school administration, the more likely they are to address it.
The squeaky wheel gets the oil.
It's true.
It's very true. One thing, if you don't mind, you brought up cost and allocation of funds. I think if you don't mind, can I go into that real quick? This was another really important paradigm shift for me. The idea of looking at things, especially food, instead of looking at them as expense, looking at them as investment. So expense is almost entirely negatively connotated. It's all, it's like coming out. It's something that I have to do away with. But when you look at it from a food perspective specifically, when I came out of college, I wasn't making probably as much money as I should have in the eyes of most people to spend the money that I was on food, because I knew enough to realize that, okay, if I invest more money, because the reality is this, like you mentioned, it's cheaper to buy that type of stuff in the middle of the grocery store. But how much lower is your output? How much lower is your quality of life? That was really important for me in kind of going full bore into focusing on my nutrition and what I eat, was the idea that this is actually an investment and it can have a positive ROI in my life that will compound over time, or it can have a negative ROI in my life and it will compound in a negative direction, which will end in God knows what. So I just feel like that's another really important paradigm. Maybe that resonates with you as well.
It does. Thinking about it as an investment is huge. You're investing in your health. You're investing in, the future of your children. It's either, investing now or that costs later, essentially. So looking at it in an investment of health is incredibly important. I talk to a lot of people about this of, okay, so maybe it is less expensive to shop down the middle of the grocery store aisles. Of course, feeding children is going to become one of my passions, but so you're feeding your kid out of the center of that grocery store aisle. It's costing a little bit less right now, but what's that going to cost them in the future? So it's either a current cost or later a cost. So yeah, switching that on its head and saying that this is an investment in health, I think is an important concept.
There's this quote that I love, and I apologize for not giving credit to whoever said it, but if you don't choose to invest in your health now, you'll be forced to pay for your sickness later. That's about as simple as it gets.
Absolutely. Well, Nolan, as we close out, do you have some final thoughts, making sure that everybody knows where to find you?
Yeah, you can find, well, first off, you can listen to my podcast. You can listen to Kara on my podcast. I think it was episode 50 something or something like that. But at the art and science of becoming sovereign, available Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all that stuff. Becoming Sovereign Pod on Instagram. But closing thoughts, I would honestly just like to thank you for having me on, and b and continue encouraging you. I want to commend you. I think it's really cool what you guys are doing. I really do believe this, having met many ranchers now, which is a privilege of mine. It's you know what I equate it to? It's the offensive line of the food system. You know how in football, the offensive line, they're the ones who make the holes for the running backs. They're the ones who protect the quarterback so they can throw the ball, but they don't get as much love. They're not like the flashy players. You guys are really the ones that are allowing everybody else to do what they do. And so I just think it's very important what you guys are doing and getting as many people tuned into what it is y'all are doing. I'm all for it. And if there's any way that I can support, I'd be happy to. But yeah, I appreciate having me on.
Thanks for being here, Nolan. So as we wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment to reflect on the power of intentional living. Sovereignty isn't just about independence. It's about creating alignment between our values and the choices we make. In a world where every decision matters, seek knowledge, engage in meaningful conversations, build a legacy rooted in purpose. Remember, each step towards understanding and empowerment shapes not just our lives, but the lives of our future generations. So stay inspired, stay intentional, and keep fueling your legacy. Thank you for tuning in to Steak Bites. Till next time.